If you've not noticed or not heard, in the chapel at 11, an AME Zion congregation is trying to get started with a new congregation, and we are providing the space in our chapel for that. We're talking to them about starting at 10:30 because last Sunday was their first Sunday, and they're much more informal, and they're not used to going on the stopwatch. And so they started at 11, and folks were wandering in at 11:20, and so they went to 1 o'clock. They didn't think they were having any children come, but they had 8 children that happened to come that ended up over in our child care. Our workers are supposed to be done at 12. They went to 1. And we weren't prepared for that with snacks or lunch or anything, so we're negotiating maybe let them start at 10:30, which would help and allow that they are going to go longer, but not push it so late in the lunch hour with children. So I don't know what that's happening. But since they're going over, we can't do our 12:10 communion in the chapel. So we're going to try just after the service, just gathering down here close, and for those that want to have communion each week, then we'll do that. But last week with the 2 baptisms and family staying around with pictures and I don't know what all was going on, but we had lots of folks after the second service just standing around down here at the front. Talky, noisy. So it was kind of hard to do a little communion for our 6, 7, 8 that want communion afterwards. So we're trying to be open and helpful. And with the terrible shootings and murders in Charleston this last week at an AME Zion congregation, it's fitting that we support them. Anyway, we are getting toward the end of Genesis, and I thought I would just fly right through to the end, but then I read the commentaries, and it's still loaded with lots of important issues for us to examine. So we're at the 47th chapter, and I'll try to quickly read through that so that we've got it fresh on our minds. 47:1. So Joseph went and told Pharaoh, "My father and my brothers with their flocks and herds and all that they possess have come from the land of Canaan. They are now in the land of Goshen," which is a subsection of Egypt, of course. "From among his brothers he took 5 men and presented them to Pharaoh." So he didn't bring the whole crowd. He just took 5 representatives. Pharaoh said to his brothers, "What is your occupation?" And remember, it was kind of crazy. Joseph said, "Don't tell him you're shepherds, because shepherds are an abomination." And here we see how well they follow the instructions. And they said to Pharaoh, "Your servants are shepherds, as our ancestors were." And they said to Pharaoh, "We have come to reside as aliens in the land, for there is no pasture for your servants' flocks, because the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. Now, we ask you, let your servants settle in the land of Goshen." And then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Your father and your brothers have come to you." Now remember, earlier Pharaoh had said, "Bring them to me." So again, we have the weaving of 2 different versions of the story, and the narrator here has tried his best to weave them together. "The land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best part of the land, and let them live in the land of Goshen. And if you know that there are capable men among them, put them in charge of my livestock." So here Pharaoh is offering work in his administration for some of the brothers of Joseph. And then Joseph brought his father and Jacob and presented him before Pharaoh. And Jacob then blesses Pharaoh, and the commentators doesn't say much about that blessing, if it's just a courteous greeting, or if it is some religious significance, as Jacob is one of the patriarchs in a special relationship with God, and that through him then God will bless Pharaoh. They didn't discuss that, but it's a possibility. It has that nuance of meaning. Pharaoh said to Jacob, "How many are the years of your life?" And Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The years of my life, of my earthly sojourn, are 130. Few and hard have been the years of my life." Few. 130, he says, few. Is that a mistake? Few have been, and hard they've been. They do not compare with the years of life of my ancestors during their long sojourn. So he's making a distinction between his life and Isaac and Abraham. Then Jacob blessed Pharaoh again and went out from the presence of Pharaoh. And Joseph settled his father and his brothers and granted them a holding in the land of Egypt, in the best part of the land, in the land of Ramesses, as Pharaoh had instructed. Now, we're calling it land of Ramesses instead of land of Goshen here. So here again is another evidence of weaving of two different versions. As Pharaoh had instructed, and Joseph provided his father and brothers and all his father's household with food according to the number of their dependents. So this is going back to the famine issue of providing the resources to survive. Now, there was no food in all of the land, for the famine was severe. Now, it seems kind of ironic that the famine is so severe, there's no food, but yet there's land. The best land is a place where they can go graze their flocks. Anyway, a few contradictions. Anyway, the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. And Joseph collected all the money to be found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan in exchange for the grain that they had bought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. And when the money from the land of Egypt and from the land of Canaan was spent, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us food. Why should we die before your eyes? For our money is gone." They're begging, "Food, please. We have no money." Anyway, but Joseph answered, "Give me your livestock, and I will give you food in exchange for your livestock, if your money is gone." And so they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses and the flocks and the herds and the donkeys. That year he supplied them with food in exchange for all their livestock. Now, horses may be a little bit of an anachronism, but anyway. When that year was ended, they came to him the following year and said to him, "We cannot hide from my lord that our money is all spent and that our herds of cattle are my lord's. There is nothing..." The herds of cattle are my lord's. That phrase, I'll come back to that in my discussion. "There is nothing left in the sight of my lord but our bodies and our lands. Shall we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land in exchange for food. We with our land will become slaves to Pharaoh. Just give us seed so that we may live and not die, and that the land may not become desolate." Now, a slight change here. It doesn't say give us grain to make bread, but give us seed so that the land may not become desolate. So at this point, it seems probable that this is at the end of the famine and it's time to plant. But all the grain had been eaten up as food, and now they need some seed. So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. All the Egyptians sold their fields because the famine was severe upon them, and the land became Pharaoh's. As for the people, he made slaves of them, from one end of Egypt to the other. Do y'all remember that from the story of Joseph? We don't emphasize that part. That seems kind of cruel and ruthless. I'll discuss that in a few minutes. Only the land of the priest he did not buy, for the priest had a fixed allowance from Pharaoh, and lived on the allowance that Pharaoh gave them. Therefore, they did not sell their land. Now, these were not Christian priests. You understand? You know, the philosophy is that people want their pastors to be poor and humble. And they pray to God, Lord, give us a pastor who is humble, and we will keep him poor. Anyway, then Joseph said to the people, now that I have this day brought you and your land for Pharaoh, here is seed for you, sow the land. And at the harvest you shall give 1/5 to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be your own. Now remember, that was the distinction in the land in the time of plenty. They would give the 1/5, the 20%, in order to be stored up and preserved for the coming famine. Anyway, you can have the other part for yourselves, your household, and as food for your little ones. And they said, you have saved our lives. May it please my Lord, we will be slaves to Pharaoh. So they're not moaning and complaining and griping about becoming slaves. They're just thankful that their lives have been saved because of Joseph's administration. So Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt, as it stands to this day, that Pharaoh should have the 5th. So as it stands to this day, so at the time of the writing, that's what's going on, and then it's projected back into time as possibly, well, this is how that came about. It's one of those etiology expressions. Anyway, thus Israel settled in the land of Egypt in the region of Goshen, and they gained possession in it, and were fruitful and multiplied exceedingly. Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years, so that the days of Jacob, the years of his life, were 147 years. And when the time of Israel's death drew near, he called his son Joseph and said to him, if I have found favor with you, put your hand under my thigh, and promise to deal loyally and truly with me. And this hand under the thigh was one of the customs for swearing a very sacred oath. Do not bury me in Egypt. When I lie down with my ancestors, carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burial place. He answered, I will do as you have said. And he said, swear to me. And he swore to him. And then Israel bowed himself on the head of the bed, which means he's close to death. Okay, that is the 47th chapter. Some interesting things in there. So, now we have all these arrangements for Joseph and his family. First it's 5, and then it's, Jacob comes himself to meet with Pharaoh. And like I said again, this number 5 had some significance, some symbolic meaning, but it's lost to us today. We've got 3 and 7 and 40 and numbers that have significant symbolic meaning, but we don't know what 5 is. In verse 7, then Jacob himself comes in for the audience with Pharaoh, and after the exchange of pleasantries and this interview with Jacob blessed Pharaoh, and then he leaves, and Joseph settles the family in the best land. In verse 11, it's calling the land Ramesses instead of Goshen, as in verse 6, where it mentions Pharaoh employs Joseph's brothers if they prove worthy to manage Pharaoh's cattle and flocks. Professor von Rad says this land of Ramesses and land of Goshen is the same strip of land, and it's known as the Wadi Tumilat. But it's meaning the same strip of property. At the time they throw in Ramesses is more likely the time of the writing, so the audience will understand what that area is. But in the earlier times and other sources, it was Goshen. Anyway, von Rad explains that the dialogue between Pharaoh and Jacob involves Pharaoh essentially asking, well, how old are you? And we would assume that Jacob is showing the signs of age. And you just wonder, well, just how old are you? And how old are you? How old are you?
Yesterday, our classroom, several asked me how old.
And well, what did you tell them?
85.
85. Good for you. But a class reunion, you didn't look 85. Well, you take good care of yourself. And that's the point we think with Jacob. He probably showed signs of age, but was still strong and had a lot of vitality. So we're just kind of wondering, some people do not have all the features of aging. The skin is not so wrinkled and still stand up straight and tall and still, have good muscle tone. And then others have, much younger sometimes have stooped and withered and they have a very wrinkly face because they spent too much time out in the sun or they smoke cigarettes too much, and those things affect skin quality. But anyway, so folks, the outward signs of age can vary greatly. But anyway, Pharaoh is curious. Well, how old are you? But Israel does not answer the question completely, just direct and simply. Well, I'm 130. He diverts the issue from simply a number of years to what has happened in those years, the quality of those years, the years of sojourning. Rather than simply numbers, it's the content, the experiences of those years. And the point is being made by this dialogue is that the sojourning was the characteristics of this whole life journey, the road of life which God had been leading not only Jacob but the patriarchs. All of the patriarchs are sojourning, and it's a symbol of a renunciation of the idea of a settled life where we are at home on our own property and we have our own government and our own system. We are a people who are vulnerable to the conditions of politics and weather and so forth, climate and all. That it's a hard life, he's trying to say, and Jacob is saying, and my life is much worse than my ancestors. We read right through that and don't think about it, but that's a very important statement because the patriarchs represent the whole people. And we don't think about it, but this is symbolized by the different tribes of Levi and Benjamin and so forth. The tribe takes the name of the patriarch, which means if you look at it, then the patriarch represents the whole clan. So the experiences of the patriarchs are describing and setting the course for what life will be like for the whole people. And just like we talked about Abraham and Sarah going down into Egypt because there was a famine, well, that's a precursor for what's going to happen with all the people. It's one of those bong kind of things you read about going down to Egypt. Well, that's a very a repeated theme that carries a lot of weight and meaning. So sojourning meant this renunciation of this settled life of land ownership. And it's a reminder then that it's a life with a call and a drive toward this hoped-for goal, this promise of entering a promised land, that God has a future for you. You're not experiencing it now, but it is in the future. So we live life never settled at home, but always looking for this future of promise, a future of promise. But Jacob's answer means for him and his forebears that this life of a sojourner becomes more and more difficult because of the political and historical circumstances. It's saying, it's worse for me. And by implication, it's going to be worse for my children who follow me. It's getting worse. And in one sense, it's the power of bad things or evil in the world seems to be growing, and it's coming at us. Now, Abraham lived 175 years and Isaac 180, but Jacob only 147. So the shortening of lifespans means life is so hard we don't get to live so long because it is hard. Anyway, after that part, I thought, well, I need to see what Professor Vaughter has to say about these verses, so I turned to his commentary. And when I did so, I found this long review of the historical conditions in Egypt that we really hadn't lifted up. And it's the whole question of the Joseph story. Does it have historical grounding, or was it just a part of the storytelling that tried to wrap all of these different groups and tribes and say we are one because we come from a common ancestor? But in fact, that may not have been historically correct, but they had become one as these different groups of people who were forming this one Israel nation, who were brought together, one by being in the same geographic location, but they had the similar belief and understanding of this God who was different than the pagan gods, that there was one God, creator above in the development. And so those things were uniting these folks. But anyway, that was one of the ways of looking at this. But the question is there any historical grounding? And Vaughter is coming out and saying, yes, there is, even though there's no evidence in the outside the Bible records. There's no listing of Joseph in the Egyptian history. There's no strong indication that the children of Israel had a rebellion and that God sent all these plagues upon Pharaoh and Egypt, and He let the people go and gave them all their gold and silver and said, "Go, leave us alone." There's not that story in the Egyptian history record. So it raises the question, where is the historical tie? And Vaughter does a very interesting analysis for that. So anyway, the characteristic of the sojourning and the entire road of the life which God has been leading the patriarchs, this sojourning meant this renunciation of ownership. But an important part of that is the repeating of the theme about Jewish identity, that life is a sojourn and life is very vulnerable. And Jacob's answer to that develops that, but the history of this narrowing of the focus to this one family is we need to understand the structure of Egypt and how it all developed. And he says Egypt is a very long narrow country. The habitable land is right at the shores of the Nile River, and it begins at Lake Victoria in Uganda for one branch, and then at the Khartoum in the Sudan, another river empties into the Nile, and it comes from Ethiopia. And after this juncture of those two rivers, the first of 6 cataracts, and these are narrowing places where the water runs fast, and that first cataract is the beginning of the land of Egypt at its southern border. And then, since the rain hardly falls anywhere in Egypt itself, sort of like out in California compared to Oklahoma, virtually all of the water has to come from the Nile. And if there are big rains in Ethiopia and up in Uganda, that would bring the floods, and then they would overflow the Nile and put silt to replenish the nutrients in the soil, and there would be good crops and a healthy economy. Egypt, however, had been divided from time to time into a southern or upper Egypt, upstream, and that covered about 400 miles from the southern end to up to Memphis. And then from Memphis on to the Mediterranean Sea is about 100 miles, and it was called Lower Egypt. And even though Pharaoh may have been recognized as ruler over all of Egypt, it was always understood as two kingdoms, never completely united. Sort of like we became a United States, which recognizes each state maintains its own identity, but it's united under a federal government. But Egypt was kind of that way, two kingdoms or two states within the one overall nation, but they kept their individual identity. And even the Hebrew word for Egypt, Mizraim, is a word that connotes duality. Sort of like our word couple. It's one word, but it connotes two. Historians believe from their studies and research that there were over 30 dynasties over Egypt, over thousands of years. And even before that, there was a long pre-dynasty period before they united under one leader. And then after uniting, the first 2 dynasties reigned for maybe 500 years at Memphis, or the Lower Egypt. And then the Old Kingdom was the 3rd to the 5th dynasties, and it was 800 years, 2850 to 2052 BC, or before the Common Era. And that was a time of building the pyramids. And between the Old and Middle Kingdoms, the 6th to the 11th dynasties, it was a time of decadence and decay, which had the capital moving back and forth between Memphis and Thebes in Lower Egypt. And the Pharaoh was weak, and so the administration of the kingdom in the local areas was often done by aristocrats and the gentry. But Pharaoh's rule was not overthrown by somebody, bumping off Pharaoh and taking his place. He remained kind of a figurehead, and it's kind of, I guess, a lot of people had, states' rights or regional rights. Well, we'll just take care of ourselves. And so they did. They didn't try to form an army and go up and march to Memphis and knock off Pharaoh and become the new king. Historically, the connection between the biblical accounts and the historical realities may have been encounters between the patriarchs and the nearest princeling, as Vaughter said. In other words, when Abraham and Sarah came down and they were at a palace with what was called Pharaoh, may not have been an actual Pharaoh. It may have been just in this region where someone else was kind of ruling that area, but wasn't the top big Pharaoh. But from 2052 to 1778 BC, in the 12th dynasty, may have been the actual historical setting for some of the events where the Israelites were encountering the Egyptian world. But the 12th century lasted 2 3/4 centuries, so that's a lot of years in this Middle Kingdom history. And then the New Kingdom, they say, started in 1610 to 1085, and actually it has some extra biblical evidence of the origins of Israel. There's Amarna letters from 1413 to 1358 was the first place we found outside the Bible of mentioning in Egyptian sources Israel. And on one of these monuments for Pharaoh of Amerneptah in 1220 BC, there is a mention. So Vodder mentions that the decline of the 12th dynasty, and then following it, the 13th to the 17th dynasties, Egypt was in a state of great disarray. It was divided between north and south. Egypt, there wasn't one strong Pharaoh who ruled that whole nation. In the lower Egypt, in the north, it was overrun or infiltrated by Hyksos, Hyksos, and that meant shepherd kings or foreign rulers. In one of the Egyptian historians, sort of like Herodotus, but the Hyksos seized power, he said, by invasion, according to this Manetho, this Egyptian historian. But Vodder says that probably was not the case. It was more probably a series of coups d'etats in Lower Egypt. Now, he was saying there wasn't a distinct large mass of this one ethnic or national group from somewhere else who was coming across the land, conquering, sort of like Alexander the Great. But it was rather some who had settled over a period of time and had gotten some power, and that they decided and had become wealthy and powerful and became a ruling class of these mixed populations, and sort of like the Amorites and the Hittites and so forth in Palestine. And of this group that are called Hyksos, had Curian names and Semitic names, would turn up about in the documents that we can find. And there was as it appears, kind of a regular ongoing struggle between the Egyptian regimes and in Thebes and some of these rulers in the areas, and it usually came to a draw that they would pay, the rulers of the Hyksos would pay tribute, and that would satisfy the weaker pharaoh or king in Thebes, and so there would be a peaceful resolution. But one of the things these Hyksos introduced, seemed to have brought, was the horse-drawn chariots used in warfare, as well as some unique building fortifications. Professor Vodder reminds us that the Egyptians built great monuments to remember the names and the rule of the great pharaohs. Or maybe we should better say the pharaohs built these monuments and put their names on them. And he mentioned that there was one pharaoh who had his name chiseled so deep into the stone because it was common that the following rulers didn't like their predecessors, and so they would order the workers to go with their hammers and chisels and chisel off that name off of the monuments, and then chisel their name, a new name in a new place. And so this practice of expunging or erasing the names, the legacy, the traces of predecessors that were not honored is probably the reason there's very little trace or history of this Hyksos people or leaders in that period of the weakened Pharaoh. So it's understandable that we don't have lots of details because anything written on paper or parchment or skins would dissolve and rot and decay, and it's really hard to preserve those. But those things chiseled in stone and other artifacts is our best and ways of knowing what's there. And mosaics on on walls and so forth. Well, anyway, Vaughter suggests that it was this period that the biblical characters interacted and sojourned in the land of Egypt. It would have been very reasonable for Joseph to have risen to such high power under one of these Hyksos leaders as opposed to, the actual Pharaoh. But in the retelling of the story, the Israelites probably couldn't tell the difference between Pharaoh and whoever else. Pharaoh kind of became the name for whoever was the supreme power that they encountered. So sort of like we have president and governor and prime minister and so forth. And those are interchangeable for different places. Von Rad suggested in his work that the verses that describe Joseph managing the drought and the transition from a free peasantry owning their own land to an absolute power where Pharaoh owns all the land may not be historically accurate or verifiable, that it happened very quickly within this few-year period when Joseph was in charge of everything, but rather a longer, slower process. But the narrator of the biblical story is really not trying to cast aspirations on Joseph for being so cruel and heartless to take the people's land and take their livestock and to enslave them for the Pharaoh. I mean, that seems terrible in our recollection today because we have a whole different understanding of independence and freedom and so forth. But within, remember in the Middle Ages in Europe, if you were lord of duke, earl, king, whatever, and you owned the land, if you conquered the land, the serfs that lived on the land were yours. I mean, that's the way the system worked. The serfs, the peasants, belonged to the land, and they didn't really own it. Like we have deeds of record and buy and sell. It was much more small communities, and they would just go out and farm whatever land was there. And the ruler of that area, there was an agreement, well, I will protect you from the raiding hordes, but you have to pay me the produce of your land, a certain percentage, and you have to work for me, and your sons have to serve in my militia or my army. And it was kind of an unwritten agreement that worked. But the one with the power to raise an army and conquer a certain piece of property then took possession of it, but then you have to hold it against others who want to come take it away from you. I think I don't know if I've told you all this. I used to be really kind of proud of my English heritage, that there is some land in England near Liverpool that's a Tankersley Park, and there used to be some kind of noble or aristocracy person who owned that land. And in those of you who do study family origins and stuff, the L-E-Y on Tankersley, the Lee or L-E-A or L-E-Y means meadow. So it was a name place for whoever this tank was. And anyway, so I used to be, we come from nobility. And then I saw the movie Braveheart, where Mel Gibson showed us how it worked. It was the meanest, nastiest, orneriest guy who would beat up anybody else and just would, go kill people in order to take their property. And I thought, oh my gosh, I can't be proud of that. But but anyway, I'm William, the Earl of Tankersley, the third. Yes. And so anyway, but that was kind of the way it worked. It, might makes not really right, but in a sense, if you have the strength, then you have the right to take possession, and it becomes yours. And if you have the strength to hold on to it, you have the right to claim it and make it yours. And so that's the way these primitive systems worked. But anyway, but the narrator is not trying to cast aspersions upon Joseph for bringing about this enslavement of the people and the Pharaoh's ownership of all of the land, this absolute ownership, divine right of kings kind of thing. Now, the question of whether for grain and the bread the Egyptians and the Canaanites actually sold their livestock to Pharaoh through Joseph and turned the livestock over to them, and then it went to the stockyards. But it's more probable and more practical. I mean, if the whole land, all the people, because of the famine, all of them give up all of their animals, where is Joseph going to put them all? Who's going to take care of them? Where's the food going to come to feed them? Or is he just going to dig a huge ditch and dump them all in it because they starved to death? It's more likely that they gave title for the livestock to the Pharaoh. They would still keep them. They would still milk the ones that produce milk. They would shear the sheep to make wool. They would, slaughter some to have something to eat. But anyway, if it's just kind of like a demand note. If Pharaoh wants it, he can come take it sometime. But in the meantime, you can use your livestock as you always have. And then when it comes to the next year, when they give up their land, again, it was probably they stayed on the land like the peasants and the serfs. They didn't have to give up their land and move to the city, but they stayed on the land. And then when it gets to the part of giving themselves over to be enslaved in order to get the seed corn or seed to sow and begin to regrow crops, then they give title to themselves, but they give title to the land, but they stay on the land. And again, kind of like a demand note, that if Pharaoh wants it, he can take possession of it. In the meantime, just kind of let things go as they are. So it's not like capturing these people and gathering them up off of the land and then transporting them someplace else and making them do slave labor. It's not that meant to be that kind of vision in our minds. But anyway, and we know our government has had this same kind of thing, only not total, but during World War II, Korea and Vietnam, there was a draft. The government said, we have the right to ask for your service for the good of the nation. And so it, in one sense, it could be looked upon as slavery. I don't want to go. Well, you have to. Because the government, the power, can ask that of you. Well, this 20% tax, does that seem excessive? Yes, it was normal. It was normal in those days. In Babylonian society, interest for purchasing seed corn, they could charge 40% interest. And in Elephantine, in the 5th century, before the Common Era or BC, they have records that the interest rate went up to 60%. Remember that when you get to doing your taxes, and it could be worse. Von Rad mentions that the style of the Joseph narratives are much in the style of the wisdom literature. Have I mentioned that before? Well, wisdom literature, if we look at Proverbs, and that Proverbs were gathered together for King Solomon and in his temple and his time when he had all these wives who had all these babies, many of whom were sons, and they were potential princes, rulers, and Solomon, remember, supposed to be wise, he wanted them educated and prepared for leadership in the future. So the book of Proverbs was pulled together mainly as a textbook for Solomon's household, all of his young sons who might become princes. And in that, it's trying to teach you, how do you negotiate, how do you behave, what kinds of things do you do. And a big part of it had to do with attitude and inner character, not how to manage minutia detail in government, but what kind of quality of person you would be. And so much of that is the wisdom literature. But it also, but with Joseph, if we look at it as a form of wisdom literature, it is showing how a young man is prepared for leadership. He goes through his very selfish, arrogant time and is humiliated through his being sold into slavery and then into prison. But in those times, he's learning how to make do and rises to positions of leadership, and he's showing his wisdom. And then when it gets to one of the main things of being a good leader on the rise is being able to be a good advisor to the top ruler who has the power and authority. And so Joseph is displaying all of these things, and then when he's given the authority to deal with the crisis, he manages it very well. You know, first he stores up all the grain, and he does so by putting this 20% tax for storing the grain, and then afterwards he manages the distribution of the grain, and he makes it through. So this is a really good example of how to be a good administrator, how to negotiate your way through tough times in the world. However, in the prophetic literature, it is not the friendly advisor that the king or the top ruler invites into the cabinet to give advice. The prophet is standing outside criticizing what the top ruler is doing to the people and to the nation. And in the prophetic literature, we have a big concern and a recurring theme that's happening where those in power, those who have the wealth, are trying to get more wealth by the way they treat their serfs, their peasants. And they are treating them in such a way that often they would have to sell their children or themselves into slavery just to survive. And this is one of the recurring themes in the prophetic writings that are condemning the house of Israel. And it is because, and the prophet is saying, that God is saying to them, your ways are not my ways. And if you don't change your ways, then this house is going to fall. God is going to bring judgment on this house by having invading armies come and conquer you. That's just a real short thumbnail sketch, but that's kind of the issue. But one of the big issues is this impoverishing the people in such a way that then you take advantage of them and you take their property, their ability to have their own piece of land to raise their food on, and then you take their lives into some kind of forced slavery because of their debts. And so that's a big contrast between the prophet's words and then what we hear about Joseph. But Joseph is not doing it for self-gain. He's doing this in order to preserve the people and to preserve a system so they can make it through the famine and get to the other side of it, and then to start up and begin to live normal lives afterwards. And like I said, not gathering up people and forcing them into servitude or slavery. It's just, like I said, more like a demand note. If Pharaoh needs you, Pharaoh has the right to take you for some project. And so what happened was then Pharaoh abused that concept and decided, I need to build myself huge monuments. Who's going to do the work? Well, I own the people. I can just go inscript whoever I want and make them do the work for me, and I don't have to pay them. And so what turned out to be a good thing then got corrupted and ended up being a bad thing. Okay. Well, that gets us through 47. And we'll be ready to move on to 48 and 49. And we're still not getting on to being done. But anyway, there are still lessons in this old story about things that relate to some of our issues today. So let us pray. Well, dear God, we thank you for the ways you do bless us. We know Jacob went in and met with Pharaoh and blessed him, which is the way we need to deal with all people to try to be a blessing. We understand that you bless us in order to be a blessing to others. So help us find the ways that indeed we can be a blessing to others in times of great trauma and violence within our own culture and society, where hate and this decision that some have that they want to kill others just to try to make some kind of statement or to try to manipulate our society. Help us be the kind of people who can turn those events around and turn them into some kind of a blessing. It's difficult, but with your love and grace and guidance, we know you will show us the way. Amen and amen.